Hey everyone, welcome to the channel Chess Professor. Today I will be teaching you the Italian games which comes after you play the move pawn to e4. Your opponent usually responds with pawn to e5 and you move your knight to f3. Now if your opponent moves his knight to c6, you can play bishop to c4 entering the Italian game. So the Italian game is one of the easiest opening which you can play with white against e4. So today I will be covering two variations, starting with the variation bishop to c5 and second knight to f6. So starting with bishop to c5. After this you have many options, but the best is to play pawn to b4 entering the Evans gambit. Your opponent usually captures with the bishop. You push your pawn. Now after this your opponent has two options. This move bishop to c5 or bishop to a5. Starting with bishop to c5, you play pawn to d4. Now your opponent usually captures and you instead of recapturing just castle. Now your opponent if captures one more pawn, you sacrifice your bishop. Your opponent takes and you do this fork and then capture the bishop on the next move. For example, now you just captured the bishop. Now this pawn is also attacked twice and there is no way to defend it. For example, if this move, this and also after this, we are also threatening this pawn which goes for the rook. So there are many possible things after this. And even if your opponent defends in any way, if you see your opponent can't castle, your opponent you have the center, you have your queen developed and threatening many pieces. Also you can move your pawn creating even more pressure and many things, meaning you have just gotten very dominant position. Now here if your opponent doesn't captures and plays something else, plays something sorry not this if your opponent plays something else, you you can also you can also capture or you can go for this double attack idea. For now let's suppose you captured and now you have an very great position. Even if your opponent captures, you can just pin this knight from the row. Of course your opponent can't capture because of this bishop. If this bishop goes back, you can go for this double attack idea. After this, if your opponent didn't even capture the first pawn and let's suppose moved something else, then you can go for this double attack idea. Now let's suppose your opponent captured with the knight. Now see, you have just gotten the same position as earlier. Now here there is one important move to notice. If you played b4 and your opponent just moved the bishop back, still you play d4. If your opponent captures, you castle. If your opponent recaptures, you go for this double attack idea as usual. And after that, you can also capture this pawn after let's suppose any move. You can just capture this pawn with your knight. And now see, you are putting pressure. You can even put pressure with the knight. You have the center. All, all also almost all of your pieces are developed except the bishop. So meaning you have a better position compared to black. Now, if your opponent didn't even capture this pawn, let's suppose your opponent played something like bishop to c6. You can remember this move a4, and if your opponent is careless and played something like this, you can play pawn to e5, and now the bishop is trapped. Now, even if your opponent thought of sacrificing the knight, still you have a knight and still you have an extra piece for just a pawn. And if your opponent moved the bishop somewhere else, you can just you now you have to just remember of developing your pieces correctly and castling. Now let's suppose you just played the Italian game, and this time instead of this move bishop to c5, you you face this move knight to f6, entering the two knights defense. After this, you can go for the fried liver attack by playing knight to g5. Now you are attacking this pawn on f7 twice. Now the most common move is pawn to d4. You capture, your opponent usually recaptures. Now you can sacrifice your knight. Your opponent has to capture, or else the rook or the queen will be gone. Then you can play this check queen to f3, and either ways your opponent usually plays this move, and now you can capture this knight. Now you are also threatening mate on this square, so the opponent has to defend, and the opponent has to defend correctly. For example, in this case, if your opponent plays queen to e7, you can just capture this knight and also get an free rook. So that means your opponent has to uh, also uh, also prevent this checkmate in a better way. But even after this, if you see, you have just gotten an extra pawn, and also now you are in a dominant position as you are targeting some squares. So just one last thing. If your opponent instead of playing d4 played this move bishop to c5. This is now the Traxler counter attack. This time if you played this knight move, your opponent can just sacrifice the bishop, and you will just easily get checkmated. So this time just capture with the bishop. If now the king has to move, and now you move your bishop to b3, and see, even after this you have just gotten an extra pawn. So this is all about the Italian game. I hope after learning this you can easily win games. Thanks. If you like the video, please like the video, and if you are new to this channel, please subscribe. Thanks for watching.